Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are looking at English literature from 1590 to 1798, and today we will be looking at a lesson on the poet George Herbert and his poem The Collar. I am Anna Kurian and I teach at the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. We will be considering initially the main strands in 17th century poetry. From there we will be moving on to George Herbert's life very briefly, and then we will look at his work, his poetry, and finally the larger portion of our lesson will be concentrating upon his poem The Collar and its themes, its images, its structure, its title, and so on and so forth. Now 17th century poetry is famous, early 17th century poetry at least, is famous for the metaphysical poets and the cavalier poets. If that is one way of categorizing them, the other one is to categorize them as poets who wrote secular poetry and poets who wrote religious poetry. And in the secular poetry, it's mainly love poetry that they wrote, but they also wrote other varieties of verse. Now, the metaphysicals wrote both secular as well as religious verse. And prime amongst them is somebody called John Donne, who wrote a lot of love poetry. So you have poems such as The Flea, Sunrising, and several others. In terms of religious poetry, he wrote the holy sonnets. But you also have three specific poets, George Herbert, Crashaw, and Vaughan, who wrote primarily religious poets. Now the metaphysical poets, who are called thus because they were first called thus because of John Dryden and later on by Samuel Johnson, they combined a lot of feeling and passion, but also with intellectual rigor, as in they wanted to demonstrate the breadth of their reading, the breadth of their knowledge. They wanted to demonstrate to their readers that they were acquainted with what were the latest advancements in knowledge that were there in the world. They were also interested in showing the fact that it was all not just about sentiment and emotion, but also about intellect, knowledge, and a knowledge of the world at large. And if you think about the fact that at this point in time the world is growing larger and larger, then their poetry demonstrated that growing interest and engagement with the growing world. So if you look at a poem such as Donne's Sunrising, what you see is that he talks about eastern countries where there are mines, and he talks about the princes there, and he compares himself to those princes, while his beloved is of course seen as those countries. A knowledge of America and geography and so on and so forth was seen as integral to the reading of the metaphysical poets. Now they are known primarily for what were called conceits. These conceits were primarily just images, and these images were seen to be different from the images that other poets used earlier to this and later to this, because these were images which pulled together ideas and concepts that were usually not seen as going together. The formulation that Johnson put out about them was that they were heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. So ideas that do not necessarily seem to be similar were pulled together and made to be compared violently by these poets. And the most famous example is of course again from a Donne poem, wherein he compares the lovers to the legs of a compass. The woman's is the leg that stays still, the leg of the compass which stays still, whereas the man's is the one which goes roving all over the world. Now an image like that was not necessarily seen as being very loving in terms of love poetry, but John Donne made it work in his verse. Now the cavaliers, who were the other strand, the major other strand of 17th century poetry, were called thus because of their political leanings. Now most of them were royalists. They were followers of the House of Stuart, of the Stuart court, Charles II primarily, and they were also called cavaliers because they were cavalier in their treatment of both life as well as art. They did not believe that anything was to be taken very seriously. So they treated things dismissively, they treated things lightly, and even their artistic endeavors were performed with a light touch. So whether they were talking about love or whether they were talking about war, all of this was done with an extremely light touch. It also of course gives us the impression that so much of their work is frivolous and does not have lasting value, but the fact that they took themselves lightly is also something that recommends them, because their work had a very simple, direct informality about it. It was vigorous, in its love for life, and they celebrated everything to do with life, whether that was making love, whether it was the appearance of the beloved with her hair disheveled, with her clothes disheveled. They wrote about everything. The minute details of everyday life was part of their poetry. Now, moving on to George Herbert, who belongs to the metaphysicals and is seen to be in a line of direct descent from John Donne. Herbert was born into a noble family with a strong connection to both the arts and literature, especially because his mother was the patron to John Donne, who dedicated holy sonnets to her and also preached her funeral sermon. Now, born into such a family, he was also then educated and successful at school and university. In fact, so successful at university that he was the official orator for the university. So when they had to make speeches in public, it was George Herbert who did it. And George Herbert also expected to have a successful career at court. Sadly enough, did not happen, did not work out. But from the beginning, George Herbert also had very strong religious leanings. And these strong religious leanings eventually led to him seeking ordination as a church pastor, and he became the vicar of a very small country parish and retired to the countryside. So the last few years of his life he spends in a very small country parish, and over there he dies of consumption. Now, his poetry, his reputation rests upon just one volume called The Temple, and this was published posthumously. There is also an interesting story about his publication, which is that he wrote all the poems, but he sent it to his friend Nicholas Ferrar, and he said that they were not to be published unless it would help some other soul who was wrestling with God and who might find some comfort, some solace in reading this poetry. Interestingly, Herbert also destroyed much of the early poetry that he had written, which was more secular, and he only left small bits and pieces which are now available today, are very few, random, and the large body of verse that we have is this one body called The Temple, which was published in 1633 by Nicholas Ferrar after the death of George Herbert. Now, we might wonder why a poet such as George Herbert, who wrote only about religion, should have a place in the canon of English literature. Now, this place in the canon of English literature is interesting because even though he has just this one volume of verse called The Temple, his place in the canon is assured. And if you were to look at critics in the first half of the 20th century, especially people like T.S. Eliot and L.C. Knights, all of them seem to endorse the fact that his is a place which cannot be taken away from him. One, of course, he is in a direct line of descent from John Donne, and he writes poetry in the style of John Donne, but it is not that his influence is only that. His work also influenced other poets. So both Vaughan and Crashaw admit that they have a huge debt to the work of John Donne. Several minor poets as well, such as Traherne and Mildmay Fane, also claim to be in a line of descent from John Donne via George Herbert. Now, while John Donne was of course far more intellectually rigorous in his work, Herbert is noted for his very quiet sensibility and his very gentle tone. Now, Herbert, even when he is most angry, eventually at the end of the poem will return to God. John Donne is busy shouting, raving, ranting, being angry, exclaiming, is very passionate even as he speaks with his intellect and using his intelligence. George Herbert does a similar thing, but he does it with quietness. And all of George Herbert's poetry ends with the final stanzas, the final lines will always revert to a calm acceptance of God's will in his life. Now, there has been evidence that George Herbert's influence extends far beyond the poets of his own time and his own place. And critics have discovered that his influence extended to such poets as Coleridge and T.S. Eliot as well. And we see that if we were to think of a comparison to George Herbert, it would be in the work of Gerard Manley Hopkins of the late Victorian period, who also wrote religious poetry, largely only religious poetry, and destroyed all his secular verse, and yet has a place in the canon of English literature because of that poetry. Now, the one volume of verse that was published posthumously for George Herbert, The Temple. Briefly, it consists of 3 sections. It has the church porch, then the church, and finally the church militant. It begins with a dedication, ends with an envoy. Now, each of these sections, the church porch, which is exhortations to a young man as to who is about to enter into the life of the church. The church is the central portion, and that contains all the lyrics which Herbert's reputation rests upon today. And then finally there was the church militant, which talked about the fact that the church was slowly spreading and going to other countries, other nations, other lands, especially America. So what we have then is a movement from the church as it first influences a young man through the kinds of battles and conflicts that come to a person when he is part of the church, to the fact that the church then broadens out and includes more and more people and more lands. Now the church, the central portion, the church, which contains all the short lyric poems which we are familiar with of George Herbert, including Pulley, The Collar, Altar, Discipline, Love, all of them. They speak of man's relationship with God, but they also then tell us about the kinds of trials which one encounters if you try to have a good relationship with God. That it's never easy, that there are always troubles, and how you encounter those troubles and how you deal with them is what then makes your religious life stronger. And that these are a very necessary part of the everyday religious life. It also, of course, gives us several aspects of God himself, which we see over there in the poem. And we see that these aspects can lead to despair, but also eventually to calm acceptance and love. Now, of course, we come to the poem The Collar. Now, The Collar is a fairly longish poem. It has 36 lines in it, and it begins with an extremely decisive action that the speaker of the poem is performing. In fact, it begins with the speaker saying, "I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad." It begins with, therefore, somebody who's saying he's had enough. He's like fed up. He can't deal with anymore. So he's repudiating the life that he has led for so long, and he's saying that no more, I will abroad. I will leave this and I will go away. And then, of course, he tells us the litany of woes that he has. What shall I ever sigh and pine? He says, my lines in life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, large as store. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that he has nothing. Everybody else seems to have bays and there are flowers and garlands, but he himself, he has nothing. Everything has been blasted and wasted. And then finally he comes to the end of the poem and he says, he raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word. But then he says, methought I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my lord. Now the poem then moves from extreme anger through a lot of raving and ranting and growing more fierce and wild, as the poet himself says, to the last 2 lines wherein he believes that he hears a voice calling to him, and he immediately responds and he says, my lord. And it ends with that. So we are not told what happens after that, but in that acceptance of the 2 words, my lord, he accepts the lordship of God over his life, and then he moves on from there. Now the collar is alongside the pulley, which is about hope. The Collar is the most popular poem of George Herbert. It's also the most anthologized poem of George Herbert. It is a dialogic poem, a narrative poem, and it is a dramatic monologue which tells us a story. It tells us a story about the speaker's anger and his annoyance with God. He's really furious with God, which is why he begins by saying, I struck the board and cried no more. Right? He's like had it. He doesn't want to have anything more to do with God, and he's out of there. And he claims that he cannot find any meaning to the life that he has been leading for so long. So what we are then led to assume is that this person who is speaking is somebody who has denied himself and who has restricted his life, who has a very small, humble, simple life because he is following God. But doing that, he has gained nothing. He says there is no meaning to this life. There is no joy to this life, there is no harvest to this life, and he is furious about it. In that fury then he speaks to himself and he says, it need not be so. I can have a much better life if I just dump all of this. I can have a good life, a life which will be filled with lots of pleasure and lots of other things which are otherwise not available to me. So he decides that he is going to leave all of this and he will live this fuller life which is available to him. And then is when everything falls apart, because even as he decides to do this, he hears or thinks he hears, and that is something that is crucial. Does the speaker in the poem really hear a voice, or is it that he thinks he hears a voice? As he says, as I raved and grew more fierce and wild, methought I heard a voice. And methought is crucial, because what he's saying is that he just has to think that he hears a voice calling out to him. He just has to think that he hears God's voice, and that voice says, child. So he is addressed as a child of God, and immediately he of course responds saying, my Lord. Now, when we look at the structure and techniques of the poem, what we see is that it is built up in the nature of a story. We are being told a story. The speaker in the poem, and let's not get confused that this is the poet. No, it is a speaker who's speaking. There is only one speaker, and he speaks to us in different voices. And he tells us a story which is in parts. So we are constantly being asked to adjust our understanding about the story that is being told to us. So it's not this clear linear story which begins at point A and ends at point B, and where we know how exactly the story will end. No, what we are being told is, in the beginning, like he says, he struck the board and cried no more. So we think that he's fed up, he's had enough, and then as the poem progresses, we are told that he says he will leave. He's getting ready to close up shop and leave all that he has been doing all these years, and instead he will then move on to something that will be seen as more rewarding to him personally. That's the trajectory that we are being asked to believe in, and yet the trajectory changes. So when we think in terms of the speaker in the story, it's necessary to understand that though there is only one speaker, that speaker speaks in two different voices, and he's split into two parts or two aspects. The first 16 lines give us the speaker who is angry and who's rebelling, who strikes the board, who says no more, and then who goes on asking questions. He said, what? I don't have anything. Why should I go on like this? So he goes on asking questions, and he presents his anger and his outrage against God, and that anger is being given to us by him as he expresses it. From line 17 through to line 27, you have the same speaker, but now he is being slightly more restrained and he's being more rational, and he says, no, it is not like that. There is fruit, there is wine, there is corn, but you have to do something about it. You have to quit this kind of thinking that you have nothing. It depends upon yourself to make some sense of this. Now, after that, you move on to the first speaker comes back, the one who's angry, and he says, please, I am so fed up. I don't want any part of this. I'm done. And you might tell me that there is fruit and wine and corn, but that is all very limited and I don't want it. I would rather have the larger life of a person who is not part of God's work, God's kingdom. It is at that point, of course, that he thinks he hears God's voice. And all these different aspects of the speaker are then integrated into one persona. So the rebellious aspect, the one who is more rational and who says, hold on, don't go away, you will be happy in this small life of yours. Both of those aspects are then integrated into one person, and that one person just bows his head and says, my Lord, accepting whatever God has given to him. Now, if we were to look in terms of technique, a critic, Barbara Herman, has said that the final 4 lines are actually a frame for the story that the first 32 lines tell us. Now, the first 32 lines are a story of rebellion. Even though there is the saner part of the person which tells him that, no, you can make a life which is good even in this small limited life of yours, which is lines 17 to 26. That person is defeated, and the rebellious voice is gaining strength and gaining power till line 32. But at line 32, that rebellious person's perspective is cut short, and instead we revert to a perspective which has not been there in the poem at all. So the final 4 lines then provide us with a frame within which we can read the rest. So what we are reading then is a story of a rebellion which the speaker right in the beginning already knows is not a rebellion, because by the end he has accepted the lordship of God and he has returned to God humbly and with complete acceptance of the limitations that the godly life has for him. Now, therefore then, the perspective that we are being asked to look at from line 1 through to line 32 is actually a perspective that is rendered null and void by those 4 lines right at the end of the poem. Now, the poem is written in iambic verse, and the lines are short and varied, and the lines are also full of extreme emotion, anger, mostly anger, but also despair. And that anger and that despair is also given to us via a series of rhetorical questions. In fact, in the middle of the poem, you have a set of 4 to 6 lines which are only questions, where he's constantly going on asking, what? Is it all blasted? Is it all wasted? Do I have nothing? He goes on and on asking questions. And those questions are indicative of his extreme anger and his extreme despair with the life that he has. The poem, The Caller, is actually evocative because of the number of images that it contains. And those images more or less fall into some sets. So you have images which deal with the Eucharist, church communion, and harvest. Then you have images which are connected to lordship and ownership. Then you have images which are connected to punishment and punitive action of various kinds. So all of the images then fall together into certain groups, certain brackets. It begins with a very strong image of a board being struck. Now, to strike a board in terms of Christian context is, if the board is seen as being the Eucharist table or the church communion table, then it is a image that also shows us the extreme anger that the speaker feels against God, because the Eucharist table or the communion table is also the table on which the body and blood of Christ is supposed to be broken. So he is actually then striking against Christ himself when he strikes that table. And as he proceeds from striking the table, he talks about the fact that the wine and corn are all blasted and wasted. So what he says is that Christ himself has lost all power in his life, that there is nothing that can be redeemed for him, because the table of Christ, he has struck it, and the body and the blood of Christ is no longer seen as being capable of regenerating him, as giving him new life. Instead, it is something that is in itself consumed and wasted away. He also speaks in terms of harvest. He says that, does he have no harvest? Is there no fruit to gather? And he speaks of himself as somebody who is fruitless. Now, this is also an image that recurs for us. If you think about it, you have Milton who uses it, and later on Gerard Manley Hopkins who uses it, that the life of God is a life that is basically fruitless. You get nothing from following God. That working for God means that you are a failure in terms of human activities, successes, and so on and so forth. So he speaks of a series of images. If you look at the first 16 lines, you see these images of fruitlessness and a complete lack of any kind of worldly success. Interspersed with this is also the idea and the image of freedom. And he has 2 images which he primarily uses for freedom. One is, of course, the fact that he claims that he wants to be free as the road, free as the wind. And both of those images are interesting, because do roads offer that kind of freedom? We might say that the road is an image of freedom in the sense that it goes on, and you cannot stop on that road. But roads are also limited because they are man-made, they follow set paths. So is it complete freedom in that sense? Similarly, when he talks about the wind, that the wind is free. The wind is free, yes, but only insofar as humans have not put up buildings and things which stop the wind, because then the wind is also stopped. So even his images of freedom have embedded within them ideas of restraint and limitations. So when he claims that he wants to be free as the wind, free as the road, and then he says as large as store. Now, as large as store is usually interpreted as meaning abundance. Even if you think of it in terms of abundance, is abundance everlasting? Or will there finally be an end to abundance as well? So all the images that he uses of a life that he believes he can have if he leaves God are images that he thinks are images of freedom. But within it, what we see is that these are images which are also constricting, which are limited, which are restrained, and which do not finally offer this kind of complete freedom that the speaker is yearning for. Now, in addition to these, you have the images of victory and of success that he wants. And if you look at the images, they are not images of godly success, they are images of worldly success. As he says, have I no base to crown it? No flowers, no garlands gay. Now, all of these are things that are offered to people who are successful in the world. They are not offered to God's people. God's people measure success by other terms. But he himself yearns for success, and he yearns for the earthly symbols of success. He speaks of his desire for recognition and fame, and the bay is of course the laurel wreath. Now the laurel wreath is indicative and symbolic of the success that is given to people in classical times, because they are crowned with the laurel wreath, and that laurel wreath is seen as a symbol of them having achieved worldly success in Roman times. So when he says, have I no base to crown it, the year, he's asking for a sign of success which others will see. It is not just about himself. What he wants is that the world should recognize his success. It's not enough for him that God is happy with him, but he wants all the people around him to clap for him, to give him garlands, because garlands are not put on yourself. Garlands somebody else puts on you. Flowers are offered to you by people who acclaim your success. So he wants that kind of acclamation from a set of people around him who will offer him garlands, who will offer him flowers, who will offer him laurel wreaths, so that he can be crowned and he can be seen as successful by the world, not necessarily by God. Another image of a set of images that we have is images of course, restraint and punishment. And in this you have a whole bunch of them. You have a cage that he believes he is in. He's caught in a cage. Then of course he talks about the rope of sands that is there around him. And he says that rope of sands is actually good cable. It ties him up. It keeps him imprisoned. And then he says, towards the end, he says that call off your death's head and call off the fears that are like dogs. And all of these are then images of things that hem him in, that keep him restricted to the life of God. In association with the fact that all of these are seen to be things that he suffers from because he follows God, then God's calling is actually something that is very unpleasant if you look at it in the poem. It's something which offers death, which does not offer him freedom, because constantly there are vicious dogs around him which will bite him if he tries to escape. So God is actually something then which makes it difficult for him to enjoy a full life, a good life. And he resents all of this, and he is angry with all of this because he does not see any worth in the life that he lives for God. There is no success. Instead, there is a lot of fear. There are the ropes of sand. And actually, the ropes of sand image is something that is multi-layered, because sand ropes are not really substantial. You cannot tie up anybody with a rope of sand. But a rope of sand can be something that can be a constant irritant. It can also, in the mind of the speaker of the poem, it becomes good cable, it becomes a strong cable. So the rope of sand is something that's actually in his imagination and becomes something far worse than it is. What might have been a minor irritant becomes to him a strong rope which keeps him tied up in the service of God. Now, all of these images then come together to show us somebody who is so unhappy with what he has. His life is not something that makes him happy at all, and he finds nothing nourishing or sustaining in that life. We'll briefly take a look at the title of the poem. Now, the title of the poem, The Collar, of course, it is about the collar worn by clerics, vicars, pastors in the Church of England. And it's a very distinctive collar, different from the collars of ordinary men. So therefore, the collar is symbolic of the life of the speaker in the poem. But nowhere in the poem is there any mention of the collar itself. So it's only the title, in the title, that we encounter the word the collar. Otherwise, there is no collar. Now, a collar is also something which is restrictive, which hems you in. Men's shirts which have collars, if they are buttoned up to the top, can be kind of suffocating, which is why lots of young people like to wear t-shirts rather than shirts, because you can't be buttoned up. So the collar is then something that is restrictive, that is restraining, and that can often be seen as suffocating. The collar is also emblematic of slavery. Slaves wore collars of iron around their necks. and that signified slave status. So when he says he has a collar, or he is being suffocated by his collar, he is speaking in terms of the collar that is from God, but also the collar that makes him like a slave, stuck in a place where he has no freedom. But it's also, collars are put upon animals, especially dogs, and they signify ownership by somebody else, but also a method of restraining an animal. An animal which is ruled by passion rather than by reason, by passion and appetite. And what we see in the poem is a person who is speaking is ruled by his passion and his appetite rather than by his reason or by his will. So in all these aspects then, the collar is indicative of the way he sees himself. He sees himself as a slave, as an animal, but also as somebody who has lost all power over his life and is slowly suffocating in the tightness of that collar. The collar could also, of course, be collar, which we pronounce it differently today, but in those times, collar and collar would have been the same. Collar, which indicates anger and rage, and we see anger all over the poem. But finally, the collar is also somebody who calls. And that is in the last two lines. Methought I heard one calling, child. And I reply, my Lord. So the caller is the speaker whom he thinks he hears in the last two lines of the poem, and to whom he responds finally. We come to the themes in the poem, and one of the themes, of course, all pervasive, is the anger that he feels. And that anger is quoted as rebellion, as anger, as distress. But it's also fear. He is afraid of what? The anger stems from fear, the fear of wasting his life, the fear that the choices that he has made have consequences which will then be detrimental, and those consequences will lead to him making further errors. So he's all the time afraid as he speaks, and that fear leads to this terrible anger which he feels because he sees everybody else having successful lives and he sees himself rotting away in a barren life. The final theme, of course, is the acceptance that we see in the last four lines of the poem. And that does not involve an actual call, because there is no call that is heard by all of us. It's a call that the speaker thinks he hears. And from that call, there is a new understanding that emerges. And that understanding is an acceptance of his position as servant to a loving God. And that is why God calls him as child, but he answers, my Lord. So God offers him the position of child to a loving father, but he prefers to be servant to a master. And so now we've come to the end of George Herbert's The Collar. We have looked at the strands of poetry in 17th century England, but we have focused upon the images, the structure, and the main themes in the poem The Collar by George Herbert.